It sounds like the perfect business. You charge people to get in. You charge them again for every drink. The music plays on a loop, the crowd shows up on its own, and by 2 a.m, you've collected tens of thousands of dollars in a single night. From the outside, a nightclub looks like a money printing machine dressed in neon lights. And that image, that mythology, is exactly why so many people have lost everything trying to build one. Because here's the thing about nightclubs. They are one of the most capital-intensive, operationally brutal, and financially fragile businesses a person can attempt to run. The failure rate sits somewhere between 60 and 80% within the first 5 years, depending on the market and who's doing the counting. That's worse than restaurants, and restaurants are already famous for destroying fortunes. The nightlife industry chews through investors, operators, and dreamers at a remarkable pace, and it does so quietly because the ones who fail rarely talk about it. So let's talk about it. To understand why this business is so hard, you first have to understand what you're actually selling. On the surface, you're selling drinks. But that's not really it. A nightclub sells an experience, a specific emotional state. The feeling of being somewhere exclusive, somewhere alive, somewhere worth being on a Friday night. That feeling is the product. The alcohol is just the delivery mechanism. And the moment that feeling becomes ordinary, or accessible, or uncool, the business starts dying. That's a very strange thing to stake your financial life on. But that's exactly what operators do. Now let's start at the beginning, because the economics of opening a nightclub are almost violent in how quickly the costs pile up. Before a single customer walks through the door, you are already deep in the hole. A mid-sized nightclub in a major US city, think Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, will typically cost somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million just to open. That's not revenue. That's the check you write before you've made $1. In premium markets like Las Vegas or Manhattan, that number can reach $3 to $5 million or more. And the breakdown of where that money goes reveals something important about the industry structure. The biggest single cost is usually the build-out. You're taking a raw commercial space, often a former warehouse, retail unit, or restaurant, and transforming it into something that feels transportive. That means soundproofing, which alone can run $50,000 to $150,000 depending on the size. It means custom lighting rigs, speaker systems, subwoofer arrays, DJ booths, and LED installations. A professional-grade sound system for a mid-sized venue can cost $100,000 to $300,000. The bar itself, the infrastructure, not the liquor, might cost another $50,000 to $100,000. And then you have furniture, VIP booth construction, flooring, FAC upgrades, and the kitchen if you're serving food. By the time you've finished, you've spent $500,000 and the place still doesn't have a liquor license. Here's where it gets interesting, because the liquor license is its own beast entirely. In most major U.S. cities, a full liquor license, meaning you can sell beer, wine, and spirits, doesn't just require an application. It requires approval from local governments, background checks, zoning clearances, and in many cities, a public comment period where neighbors can formally object to your existence. In New York City, full liquor licenses can take 6 months to a year to obtain. In some states, liquor licenses are tied to a quota system, meaning no new ones are issued until someone surrenders theirs. When that happens, operators have to buy licenses on the secondary market, where prices for a transferable license in a desirable city can run $50,000 to $300,000 just for the permit itself. And this is before you've hired anyone, bought a single bottle of vodka, or turned on the music. Once you're open, the cost structure of a nightclub operates in a way that defies most normal business logic. In most industries, if your revenue goes up, your costs stay relatively stable and your profit margin expands. Nightclubs don't work that way. A packed house on a Saturday night generates enormous revenue, but it also generates enormous expenses simultaneously. The more successful the night, The more staff you need, the more security you need, the more liquor you burn through, and the faster your equipment gets worn down. Let's break down where the money goes on a typical operating night. Labor is the first major category. A mid-sized club with a capacity of around 400 people might employ 4 to 6 bartenders on a busy night, 3 to 5 barbacks, 5 to 10 security personnel, 2 to 4 door staff, a coat check attendant, bathroom attendants, a floor manager, and a general manager on duty. That's potentially 20 to 30 people on the clock simultaneously. If you're paying bartenders between $15 and $20 an hour plus tips, security personnel $20 to $30 an hour, and managers $50,000 to $80,000 annual salaries, the weekly labor bill for an average club adds up fast. Some mid-tier urban clubs spend $15,000 to $25,000 per week on labor alone. Then there's the talent. This is the line item that surprises people who haven't looked at the industry closely. If you're booking a mid-level DJ, someone with a real following, enough pull to bring in a crowd on a Wednesday night, you might be paying $2,000 to $10. 000 for a single night. A well-known regional act could run $15,000 to $30,000. And if you're a premium club in Las Vegas looking to book a globally recognized DJ like Calvin Harris or Tisto for a residency night, you're looking at $100,000 to $500,000 per performance. These are not exaggerated numbers. Marquis at the MGM Grand and X's at the Wynn became famous partly because of exactly those fee structures and the gamble on whether the talent would fill the room consistently enough to justify the cost. But here's the problem with the Vegas model. It works there, in a city where millions of tourists flow through every week, where the audience is essentially self-replenishing and the hotel absorbs some of the infrastructure costs. In a regular city, in a standalone club, the economics are completely different. You don't get millions of tourists. You get the same local population week after week, and they're fickle. They move on. That brings up one of the most underappreciated dynamics in the nightclub industry, the life cycle problem. Clubs have a natural lifespan. An opening weekend generates buzz simply because it's new. The first 6 months are often the strongest, as curiosity drives foot traffic. Then, typically somewhere between year 1 and year 3, something starts to shift. The novelty fades. A competitor opens. A neighborhood changes. The crowd that made the place feel alive starts migrating somewhere else. Industry veterans call this the treadmill you have to keep spending on renovations, rebooking bigger talent, and reimagining the experience just to stay relevant. The moment you stop investing, the decline accelerates. There are famous examples of this. Crowbar in Chicago was one of the most celebrated clubs in the country in the early 2000s, drawing international talent and massive crowds. By the mid-2000s, it was struggling, and eventually it closed. Pacha, New York opened with enormous fanfare in 2005 as part of the global Pacha brand, became a genuine institution of the Manhattan nightlife scene, and then quietly shut its doors in 2016. A victim of shifting tastes, rising rents, and noise complaints. Avalon in Hollywood has reinvented itself multiple times over 2 decades just to stay standing. Now comes the part nobody talks about, which is the revenue side, and how fragile it actually is. On a strong Saturday night, a well-run club with 400 to 500 people might generate $40,000 to $80,000 in total revenue. That sounds extraordinary until you understand how it's structured. Roughly 70 to 80% of revenue in most clubs comes from alcohol sales. Cover charges typically represent 10 to 20%. VIP packages, which we'll get to in a moment, make up the remainder. The gross margin on alcohol is actually decent. A bottle of premium vodka might cost the club $25 to $40 wholesale and sell for $400 to $600 as a bottle service package. That's an 80 to 90% gross margin on paper. But here's where the math gets complicated. That gross margin doesn't account for the cost of the labor to serve it. The glassware breakage, the spillage, The free drinks comp to bring in VIP guests. The theft and alcohol theft in bars and clubs is a genuinely significant problem, estimated to account for 20 to 25% of poured product in some venues, or the simple fact that you can only sell so many bottles in a 4-hour operating window. VIP bottle service is the part of the business that became synonymous with nightclubs in the 2000s. And it's worth understanding why. Because it wasn't invented for lifestyle reasons. It was invented for economic ones. The model was pioneered in the late 1990s and early 2000s at clubs like Marquee in New York, and spread rapidly, because it solved a fundamental operational problem. A club has finite floor space. Every square foot of that floor has a cost rent, staffing, overhead, a table of 4 people buying a $1. 500 bottle service package generates more revenue per square foot per hour than 20 people on the dance floor with $12 cocktails. The math is obvious. Bottle service turned the most expensive real estate in the club, the VIP section, into the highest revenue section. It also created a social dynamic where being seen in the section became a status signal, which in turn attracted more people willing to pay for that signal. The problem is that as bottle service became universal, it also became expected, and then it became resentment. By the early 2010s, a significant portion of the audience that nightclubs depended on young urban professionals started to feel that the model had become predatory. Pay $2,000 to sit at a table, share 3 bottles of mediocre vodka with 6 people, and feel like you're being farmed. The underground scene, the warehouse parties, the smaller festival-adjacent events began pulling audiences away from the big club model. And then 2020 arrived. It is impossible to tell the economics of nightclubs without addressing what COVID-19 did to the industry. Nightclubs were among the first businesses to close in March 2020 and the last to reopen in most markets. The average closure lasted 12 to 18 months. Some clubs never reopened at all. A study by the Nighttime Industries Association in the UK estimated that more than 50% of nightclubs that closed during the pandemic had permanently shut by the time restrictions lifted. In the United States, the National Independent Venue Association reported that by mid-2020, 90% of independent venues were at risk of permanent closure without federal assistance. Many received it through the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, but many did not survive the wait. The operators who did survive faced a changed market. Consumer habits had shifted. People had gotten used to staying home, to streaming, to house parties, to smaller, intimate gatherings. The energy that powers a nightclub, the collective willingness of thousands of people to go out on the same nights every week, didn't snap back instantly. Some markets recovered quickly. Miami came back almost aggressively, and cities like Nashville and Austin barely seemed to slow down once restrictions eased. But in markets like New York and Chicago, the recovery was slower, uneven, and punctuated by a labor shortage that made staffing clubs nearly impossible in 2021 and 2022. And this is where everything changes in how you think about the long-term structure of this industry. The clubs that have survived and even thrived in the post-2020 landscape have almost universally done one of two things. Either they've moved upmarket higher prices, tighter guest lists, better production values, positioning themselves as genuine luxury experiences, or they've moved toward multi-format venues that don't depend on the nightclub model alone. The latter strategy is increasingly common. A venue that operates as a concert space on Thursday, a club on Friday and Saturday, a private event venue on Sunday, and brunch service on the weekends. That venue has diversified its revenue in a way that pure nightclubs never could. The fixed costs of the space are now being shared across multiple income streams. The math on this is compelling. If a standalone nightclub is open 4 nights a week and generates $60,000 in revenue on its best nights, that's a ceiling of around $240,000 per week at full capacity, which almost never happens. a multi-format venue that runs events 6 days a week, hosts private corporate events at $20,000 to $50,000 a pop, and sells sponsorship packages to alcohol brands. That venue has a fundamentally different financial profile. Alcohol brands in particular have become increasingly important. Sponsors like Absolut, Patron, Grey Goose, and Hennessy will pay clubs significant fees for official brand partnerships, exclusive pouring rights, and co-branded events. A premium club in a major city can negotiate $100,000 to $500,000 per year in brand partnership deals, which essentially becomes pure additional revenue on top of the normal operating business. Now let's talk about the actual profit margins, because this is where the mythology of the nightclub business really breaks down. A successful mid-sized nightclub in a competitive urban market, and by successful I mean one that's been around for more than 3 years, has a consistent crowd, and is considered respected in its scene, might generate $3 to $8 million in annual revenue. After labor, rent, alcohol costs, insurance, talent booking fees, security, utilities, accounting, legal, licensing fees, marketing, and maintenance, the net profit margin for a well-run club lands somewhere between 5 and 15%. That means a club doing $5 million a year in revenue might clear $250,000 to $750,000 in actual profit. Which sounds fine until you remember that the owners likely invested $1 to $2 million to open it, took enormous personal and financial risk, and built a business that could lose its lease, have its license revoked, or simply fall out of fashion at any moment. Compare that to a standard SaaS company or even a well-run restaurant group. A restaurant group operating multiple locations might achieve similar margins, but with lower volatility, lower regulatory exposure, and a much more predictable customer base. The risk-adjusted return on a nightclub investment, when you actually calculate it, is not particularly attractive. The allure is not financial. The allure is social, experiential, and status-driven, which means the people who open clubs are often not the right people to operate them as businesses. There's a pattern that repeats itself across the industry. A wealthy individual, maybe a real estate developer, a tech entrepreneur, a sports figure, decides they want to own a nightclub because it's glamorous. They invest $1 million, hire operators to run it, and for the first year or two, they get the lifestyle that goes with it. They get their table on Saturday night, they get the networking, they get the cultural cachet, and then the losses start. The operator they hired can't hit the numbers. The neighborhood that seemed perfect has changed. And because the investor didn't understand the business going in, they don't know how to diagnose the problem until it's too late. This is probably the single most common failure mode in the industry. The operators who last and there are some tend to share a few common traits. They understand that their real job is not nightlife. Their real job is real estate negotiation, liquor license management, labor law compliance, and marketing. They negotiate short initial leases with options to extend, so they're not trapped in a dying location. They build their core staff carefully and pay them enough to create loyalty, because turnover in nightclub staff is savage, and the institutional knowledge of a great bar manager or head of security is worth more than most owners admit. And they treat the experience as a product that requires constant iteration, not just putting on the same night every week and hoping the crowd stays. The future of the nightclub business, if it has one in its traditional form, probably looks less like the mega clubs of the 2000s and more like a collection of smaller, more specialized, more experientially specific venues. The data supports this. According to IBIS World, the U.S. nightclub industry generated roughly $3 billion in annual revenue in the years leading up to 2020, down from a peak closer to $5 billion in the mid-2000s. The trend line, even before the pandemic, was already compressing. Rising commercial rents in most major cities have made the economics harder. Noise ordinances have gotten stricter. And the competition for leisure spending from streaming platforms, gaming, food experiences, and short-form travel has intensified dramatically. Some of the most interesting businesses in the space right now are the ones that have essentially redefined what a nightclub is. Avant Gardner in Brooklyn, which encompasses multiple indoor and outdoor stages, runs events 6 days a week, and attracts both local crowds and destination attendees from across the country, represents a model that feels durable. It's experiential at scale, but diversified enough that no single night's failure is catastrophic. It's closer to a small festival operation than a traditional club, and that distinction matters enormously in the financials. So here's the honest summary of what owning a nightclub actually means. You are building a business with high startup costs, thin margins, extreme regulatory exposure, a product that has an expiration date, and a customer base that will abandon you the moment something shinier opens across the street. You are in the business of manufactured emotion and manufactured exclusivity, and the moment either of those things is perceived as fake, the business dies. The best operators in the world understand this and build their operations around it, keeping the experience fresh, the relationships tight, and the financial structure lean enough to survive the inevitable slow months. It is not an impossible business. The ones that survive a decade in a major market, the clubs that become genuine institutions, are testaments to what disciplined, creative, relentlessly attentive operators can build. But they are the exception. The mythology says the nightclub is where the money is. The reality is that the nightclub is where the money goes, and only the most clear-eyed operators ever figure out how to make it come back.